The grand hall shimmered with golden lights, the chandeliers casting soft glows on the crowd of elegantly dressed guests. Laughter and chatter filled the air as the rich and powerful mingled, raising glasses of champagne to celebrate Alexander Blake's wedding. Alexander, a tall man with perfectly combed dark hair and a sharp suit, stood at the center of attention. His smile carried a mix of pride and self-importance as guests congratulated him on marrying Sophia, the stunning bride by his side. Sophia, graceful and warm, was the perfect picture of happiness. Her flowing white gown sparkled as she laughed with friends and hugged family members. She glanced at Alexander, her joy evident. "It's perfect, isn't it?" she said softly to him. Alexander nodded. "Of course it is. Only the best for a Blake wedding," he replied confidently, his voice loud enough for those around him to hear. Among the guests, the waitstaff moved quietly, ensuring everything went smoothly. Jamal, a young black waiter with a calm and focused demeanor, worked diligently, balancing trays of drinks and hors d'oeuvres. Though the guests hardly noticed him, his sharp eyes took in everything. As Jamal made his way through the crowd, carrying a tray of champagne flutes, someone bumped into him from the side. The tray tilted slightly, and a few drops of champagne splashed onto the edge of a nearby table. The minor mishap caught Alexander's eye. "Hey," Alexander snapped, turning toward Jamal. His voice cut through the festive air like a knife. Jamal quickly adjusted the tray and wiped the table edge with a napkin he carried. "I'm very sorry, sir," he said politely, keeping his head down. Alexander frowned, his voice cold. "Sorry. You need to be careful. Do you know how expensive this event is?" Sophia placed a gentle hand on Alexander's arm. "It's fine, Alex. It was just a small accident." But Alexander shook his head, unwilling to let it go. "Small accidents lead to bigger problems," he muttered, glaring at Jamal. Jamal stood silently, his calm demeanor masking the sting of embarrassment he felt. He nodded slightly and moved away to continue his work. Other staff members exchanged glances but said nothing. As the evening went on, Alexander's mood lightened, and he quickly forgot the incident. He continued entertaining his guests, sharing stories of his successes and cracking jokes that earned polite laughter. Meanwhile, Jamal retreated to the back of the venue, taking the moment to collect himself. He leaned against a wall, his thoughts drifting. It wasn't the first time he'd dealt with someone like Alexander. Still, there was something about this event, something about Alexander himself, that tugged at the edges of Jamal's mind, though he couldn't quite figure out what it was. As the music swelled and the celebration continued, the night seemed ordinary for everyone except Jamal. For him, it was the beginning of something extraordinary, something that would change his life forever. Unbeknownst to both Jamal and Alexander, their lives were about to collide in a way neither could have predicted. As the night went on, the grand wedding reception was filled with laughter, music, and elegant conversations. Guests danced, clinked glasses, and congratulated the happy couple. The wedding had all the makings of a perfect night, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He tried to stay busy, refilling drinks, serving appetizers, and moving quietly between the guests, but the sting of Alexander's harsh words still lingered in his mind. At one point, Jamal was making his way through the crowd when he overheard a conversation between two guests. "Did you hear? Alexander Blake's family is worth billions. They practically own half the city," one of them said with admiration. Jamal felt a knot form in his stomach. It wasn't the first time he'd heard people speak about Alexander's family in such high regard. But tonight, it seemed louder, more exaggerated. He tried to ignore it and focused on his job, but it was hard not to feel like a small piece in a much bigger puzzle. Meanwhile, Alexander was enjoying the attention. He laughed with friends, showed off his new wedding band, and recounted stories of his business successes. But even with all the compliments and praise, there was something about his behavior that left a bitter taste in the air. His smile seemed almost too perfect, as if he was trying to convince himself of his own importance. Sophia, on the other hand, was glowing. She moved through the crowd with grace, accepting congratulations from family and friends. She was happy, but there was a quiet concern in her eyes when she saw how Alexander had treated Jamal earlier. Later in the evening, when the dance floor was filled with swirling couples and soft music, Sophia took a moment to pull Margaret, her closest friend, aside. Margaret was the only one who seemed to notice that something was off about the way Alexander had acted. "I don't know what happened back there, but I didn't like the way he spoke to that waiter," Sophia said quietly. Margaret nodded, her expression serious. "I noticed it too. He was rude, but we both know Alexander can be, well, he's a bit full of himself sometimes." Sophia frowned. "It's not just that. It's the way he acted like the staff were beneath him. Jamal didn't deserve that. Maybe it's the pressure of everything, you know. Weddings, big families, the expectations." Margaret offered an explanation, though her tone wasn't entirely convincing. Sophia sighed. "I want to believe that, but it still doesn't sit right with me." Meanwhile, Jamal continued to move through the venue, trying to keep his focus on the tasks at hand. But the look in Alexander's eyes earlier was hard to forget. It wasn't just the insult, it was the way Alexander had looked at him, like he was nothing. Jamal had seen that look before, too many times. But tonight, something felt different. Jamal's thoughts drifted again to his past. He had been adopted at a young age, never knowing his real family. The years of searching for his biological family had led him here, to this night, serving drinks at a wedding. He didn't know why he felt the way he did, but something told him that there was more to Alexander's family than just their wealth and status. As the evening continued, Jamal found himself wondering, was it just coincidence that he was here tonight, or was something bigger at play? The tension in the air grew stronger. Alexander's behavior might have seemed normal to most of the guests, but for Jamal, it felt like a sign. Something was about to change. He could feel it in his bones. As the night wore on, the wedding reception continued with its glamorous energy. The music played softly in the background, and guests danced beneath the twinkling lights. But in the quieter corners of the venue, conversations were taking a different turn. Margaret, who had been watching the events unfold all evening, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling she had after the interaction between Alexander and Jamal. She knew Alexander well enough to see that he could be arrogant, but she had never seen him treat anyone like that before. It bothered her, especially because she had grown fond of Sophia and wanted nothing but happiness for her. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself near the back of the hall, where the staff were preparing more food. She spotted Jamal near the kitchen, carefully organizing his tray of appetizers. His eyes were focused, but there was a quiet sadness about him. She decided to approach him. "Hey, Jamal," Margaret said, trying to sound friendly. Jamal looked up, surprised to see her. "Oh, hi. Can I help you with something?" Margaret smiled gently, seeing the weariness in his eyes. "I just wanted to apologize for what happened earlier. You didn't deserve to be treated like that." Jamal nodded, his expression softening. "It's all right. It's not the first time someone's looked at me like that." Margaret frowned. She could hear the bitterness in his voice, and it made her feel uncomfortable. Still, that was a bit much. "I know Alexander can be. Well, he can come across as a bit self-centered sometimes, but he's not usually like that." Jamal didn't respond right away. He took a deep breath, as if carefully choosing his words. "It's not just that. It's the way he spoke to me, like I was nothing, like I didn't matter." Margaret paused. She hadn't fully understood the depth of what had happened, but now she could see how much it had affected Jamal. "I'm sorry, Jamal. You're right. No one should treat anyone like that, no matter who they are." There was a long silence between them. Jamal's hands were still busy with his work, but he seemed distracted, lost in his own thoughts. Margaret wasn't sure how to make him feel better, but she wanted to understand. "You know," Margaret began, her voice soft. "I couldn't help but overhear some things earlier. About you and your family." Jamal looked up sharply, his brow furrowed. "My family?" Margaret nodded. "Yeah, you mentioned you were adopted, right? Well, I remember hearing a story about Alexander's family. There's something about a child. About you, actually. I think you might be related to them." Jamal blinked in surprise, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "Related? To Alexander?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I don't know all the details, but I think it's possible that you and Alexander share a connection. A long-lost relative, maybe." Jamal shook his head slowly, as if trying to process the information. That's impossible. I don't have any family like that. I've been searching for years, but—" Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice calming. "I know it's a lot to take in, but I think you should know. There's more to this story than you realize, Jamal. More than just a simple wedding." Jamal took a deep breath. The idea of being related to Alexander felt too strange, too unreal. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was something to it. As the conversation came to an end, Jamal felt a mix of confusion and hope. Could it be true? Was he really connected to the family he had been searching for all his life? The night's events had taken an unexpected turn. The man who had insulted him might hold the key to the answers Jamal had been seeking for years. But whether he would find those answers, and if they would change everything, remained to be seen. The evening celebration continued as the wedding guests danced and laughed, unaware of the quiet conversations happening behind the scenes. Jamal's mind raced with questions after Margaret's revelation. Could it be possible that he was related to Alexander Blake? The thought seemed unbelievable, yet something deep inside him stirred, a feeling he couldn't ignore. Back in the main hall, Alexander was enjoying himself, surrounded by his friends and family. His charm was effortless, and he laughed loudly at the stories shared by his guests. But despite the laughter, he couldn't help but feel a small unease in the pit of his stomach. There was something off about tonight, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Meanwhile, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Jamal. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that there was some connection between him and the Blake family. Her mind raced as she recalled an old conversation she'd had with Alexander's father, Jonathan Blake, many years ago. She remembered him telling her about a secret from his youth, one that he had only shared with a few close friends. It was a story of a brief relationship Jonathan had had when he was younger, a relationship that had ended abruptly. Jonathan had never spoken of it much, but Margaret had always suspected that it was more than just a fling. In fact, Jonathan had once mentioned a child who had been given up for adoption shortly after birth. Could Jamal be that child? Margaret's heart raced as she pieced the details together. She decided that she couldn't keep this information to herself. If Jamal really was Alexander's brother, he deserved to know. Margaret found herself near Jonathan Blake, who was sitting quietly with a glass of wine in hand. He looked calm, almost too calm, considering the wedding's energy around him. She approached him, her expression serious. "Jonathan, I need to talk to you," Margaret said softly. Jonathan looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Is everything all right?" Margaret hesitated for a moment. "I think you know something I need to understand. About Jamal." Jonathan's expression shifted, and for a split second, Margaret saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. He quickly masked it with a smile. "Jamal, what about him?" "I know about the story," Margaret said gently. "About your past, and the child who was given up for adoption. Could Jamal be the one?" Jonathan's face tightened, and he lowered his glass slowly. "You shouldn't have brought this up now, Margaret." His voice was quiet, almost pleading. Margaret's heart pounded. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew she couldn't back down. "Is it true? Is Jamal your son?" Jonathan paused, taking a deep breath before finally nodding. "Yes, but I never intended for it to come out this way." Margaret's mind was racing. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Jamal, the quiet waiter who had been insulted by Alexander earlier, was possibly Alexander's long-lost brother. It was too much to process in one moment. "You need to tell Alexander," Margaret insisted. "He has the right to know." Jonathan's eyes filled with regret. "It's not that simple. I've kept this secret for years. If Alexander finds out, it could tear everything apart." But Margaret wasn't so sure. The truth had a way of coming out, no matter how hard people try to hide it. And now, Jamal had unknowingly stumbled into the story. Back in the kitchen, Jamal was still trying to make sense of everything. His heart was heavy, and the idea that he could be a part of this wealthy family seemed like a dream he couldn't quite grasp. But the feeling in his gut told him that this night was going to change everything. As the night grew later, Jamal couldn't shake the thought that perhaps his past and his connection to Alexander were closer than he had ever imagined. The evening's festivities continued as guests danced, chatted, and celebrated the union of Alexander and Sophia. The hall was filled with joy and laughter, but underneath the surface, there was an undeniable tension that lingered in the air. Jamal, still processing the strange conversation with Margaret, moved through the crowd, his thoughts clouded with confusion. He kept his eyes down, working quietly as the night unfolded. Margaret, too, couldn't shake the weight of what she had learned. She knew she had to act. Her conversation with Jonathan had opened a door to a truth that no one had expected. The secret about Jamal being Jonathan's son could change everything. She had to make sure Alexander found out. Soon. She glanced around the room, looking for the right moment to speak with Alexander. She saw him laughing with some of his friends at the bar. His face was full of smiles, his posture relaxed, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind him. Margaret knew she had to find a way to break the news without causing a scene, but it wasn't going to be easy. After a few more minutes, Margaret made her way over to Jonathan, who was standing near a quiet corner of the hall, away from the celebrations. His face looked strained, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something else, something darker. "Jonathan, we need to talk," Margaret said, her voice firm. Jonathan turned to her, his eyes darting nervously. "What is it now, Margaret?" "I spoke with Jamal. He deserves to know the truth," Margaret said, her voice low but insistent. "And so does Alexander." Jonathan's face paled, and he looked away. "You don't understand. It's not that simple. If Alexander finds out..." Margaret shook her head. "It is simple, Jonathan. The truth always comes out, sooner or later. You can't hide it forever. You need to tell him." Jonathan sighed deeply, looking as though the weight of years of secrets had finally caught up with him. "I don't know how to explain it to him. Alexander has his life planned out, his business. If he learns the truth now, everything could fall apart. But he has the right to know." Margaret pressed. "You're his father, and Jamal is his brother. You can't keep this from him forever." Jonathan looked torn. I never thought it would end up like this. I thought we could keep the past buried." Margaret took a step closer, her voice softening. "Jonathan, you're not doing anyone any favors by keeping this secret. It's time for both of them to know the truth." Meanwhile, Alexander had started to notice the subtle change in the atmosphere. The laughter around him had begun to quiet, and there was a sense of unease in the air. He felt the shift, but he didn't know why. He glanced at Sophia, who had been watching him from across the room, a concerned look on her face. "What's going on?" he asked her, frowning. Sophia hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to where Margaret and Jonathan were standing. She didn't know how to explain it, but she could tell something was happening. "I don't know," she replied, her voice soft, "but it doesn't feel right." Alexander turned his attention back to his father and Margaret, who were now deep in conversation. Something in their exchange caught his eye, something he couldn't quite place. The tension was growing, and the sense that something was about to be revealed was becoming stronger. As the night continued, the uneasy feeling that had settled over the room grew. "Jamal, unaware of the storm gathering around him, remained focused on his work. But inside, he felt a growing sense that his life was about to change forever. The secrets that had been kept from him for so long were no longer hidden. He could feel it in his bones, and in that moment, he knew that by the end of the night, the truth would come out. The night had begun to wind down, but there was a quiet energy in the air that felt different, like a storm was brewing. Guests continued to enjoy the music, the food, and the drinks, but Margaret couldn't stop thinking about what she had just learned. The truth about Jamal and Alexander's connection was like a weight pressing down on her chest, and she knew she couldn't hold it back any longer. She had already spoken to Jonathan, but he seemed reluctant to face the truth. Margaret, however, couldn't ignore what had to be done. Jamal deserved to know, and so did Alexander. The two men were linked by blood, and neither of them knew it yet. Margaret found herself walking toward Jonathan again. This time, he wasn't near the quiet corner. He was standing alone by the edge of the dance floor, a drink in hand, watching the celebration unfold before him. His expression was troubled, and his posture was stiff, as if the weight of the evening's events had finally begun to sink in. "Jonathan, it's time," Margaret said softly, walking up to him. Jonathan turned, his face a mixture of fear and regret. "I know," he said quietly, "but how do I even begin to explain this to Alexander?" Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "You don't have to explain everything at once, but you have to tell him the truth. He's your son, and so is Jamal." Jonathan took a long drink from his glass, his mind racing. What if he doesn't believe me? What if it changes everything? "You can't keep running from it," Margaret said firmly. "The truth always comes out in the end, Jonathan. It's time for Alexander to know, and for Jamal to know who he really is." Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, taking in a deep breath. "All right," he said finally. "I'll talk to Alexander. But I need your help. I can't do this alone." Margaret nodded. "We'll do it together." Meanwhile, Alexander was still chatting with friends, but his mind kept wandering. He had noticed the odd exchange between his father and Margaret earlier, and the tension was still hanging in the air. Something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. As the evening continued, he noticed Jamal passing by, his eyes avoiding the crowd, focused only on his duties. Something about Jamal caught Alexander's attention, though he couldn't understand why. He had been so quick to judge Jamal earlier, but now he felt an odd pull toward the young man. There was something about him that seemed familiar, though Alexander couldn't explain it. At that moment, Jonathan and Margaret approached Alexander. The two of them looked serious, and their expressions were enough to make Alexander's heart skip a beat. "Son," Jonathan began, his voice steady but tense, "we need to talk." Alexander raised an eyebrow, confused. "About what, Dad?" Margaret stepped forward, her voice softer now. "About Jamal." The mention of Jamal made Alexander's stomach twist. He had already insulted the young man earlier, and now it seemed that there was more to the situation than he had thought. "Jamal," Alexander said slowly. "What about him?" Jonathan took a deep breath. "Jamal is not just any waiter, Alexander. He's your brother." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Alexander stared at his father, unsure if he had heard him correctly. "My brother," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. Jonathan nodded. "Yes, Jamal is your half-brother. He's the son I had many years ago, with someone I met before I married your mother. I kept it a secret for all these years, but it's time you knew the truth." Alexander's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His brother, the man he had just insulted, was his own flesh and blood. The world around him seemed to blur as he tried to process the revelation. For a moment, he was speechless. Then, slowly, the weight of his earlier actions sank in. He had treated his brother, his own family, like an outsider, someone beneath him. The guilt hit him like a wave, and he didn't know what to say. Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her voice kind. "You need to go to him, Alexander. You need to make things right." Alexander nodded slowly, the reality of the situation sinking in. His world had just shifted in a way he could never have imagined. His relationship with Jamal, his brother, was about to change everything. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air as Alexander stood there, his mind racing. His father's words echoed in his ears. "Jamal is your brother." It was almost impossible to believe. The man he had treated so badly, the waiter he had scolded earlier, was actually his half-brother. The truth felt like a punch to his gut, and for a moment he felt completely lost. What do I do now?" Alexander muttered, almost to himself. He could feel the eyes of his father and Margaret on him, waiting for him to take action. But all he could think about was the way he had treated Jamal, his own brother. "Alexander, you have to go to him," Margaret urged gently, her voice soft but insistent. "You need to apologize, explain everything. It won't be easy, but it's the right thing to do." Alexander nodded slowly, his heart heavy with guilt. He knew Margaret was right, but it didn't make the task any easier. The thought of facing Jamal, the man he had insulted, made his stomach churn. What could he possibly say to make up for what he had done? "I'll talk to him," Alexander said, his voice quiet. He didn't feel ready, but there was no turning back now. He had to face the consequences of his actions. Margaret gave him a reassuring smile. "You're doing the right thing." With a deep breath, Alexander turned and walked toward the staff area, where he had last seen Jamal. The noise of the party seemed distant now, as if the world had narrowed down to just this moment. He felt like he was walking through a fog, his steps slow and heavy. Jamal was in the back, taking a break. He sat by himself, his shoulders slumped, his eyes distant as he stared at the ground. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, unaware that Alexander was approaching. Alexander stopped a few steps away from him, unsure of what to say. He had no idea how to begin this conversation, and for the first time, he felt completely out of his element. The man he had judged, the man he had treated with such disrespect, was now his brother, his family. "Jamal," Alexander said, his voice unsteady. Jamal looked up, his eyes meeting Alexander's. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, but it quickly faded, replaced by a guarded expression. "What do you want?" Jamal asked, his tone cool but not unfriendly. Alexander swallowed hard, fighting the urge to turn and walk away. He couldn't run from this. He couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. "I owe you an apology," Alexander said, his voice rough. "Earlier tonight, I treated you terribly. I insulted you, and I'm sorry. I was wrong." Jamal studied him carefully, his face unreadable. "You were," he agreed quietly. "But I'm not sure an apology will make much of a difference now." Alexander's chest tightened at the coldness in Jamal's voice. He couldn't blame him. After everything he had done, an apology probably didn't mean much. But Alexander couldn't give up now. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Alexander continued, his voice sincere. "But there's something I need to tell you, something I just found out." Jamal raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but still cautious. "What is it?" "Jamal, you're not just a waiter. You're not just someone I insulted," Alexander said, his voice softer now. "You're my brother, my half-brother, my father. He never told you, but we share the same blood. You and I, we're family." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jamal's expression shifted, his eyes widening in disbelief. He blinked, as if trying to process what Alexander had just said. I don't understand," Jamal said, his voice cracking slightly. "How is that even possible? Why didn't anyone tell me?" Alexander took a deep breath, his own emotions rising to the surface. "My father kept it a secret for years. He didn't want you to know, but I'm telling you now. You and I, we're brothers. And I'm sorry for everything I said earlier. I was wrong." Jamal looked away for a moment, his face hard to read. The silence between them stretched on, thick with emotion. Then, finally, Jamal spoke. "You don't get to just apologize and make everything okay," Jamal said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I appreciate you telling me the truth." Alexander nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sorrow. He knew it would take time for Jamal to forgive him, if he ever did. But at least, for the first time, they were being honest with each other. Jamal stood up, looking Alexander in the eye. "I don't know what comes next, but I think we need to figure it out, together." Alexander nodded, a small sense of hope rising within him. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But at least they had taken the first step toward something better, toward a relationship neither of them had ever expected. The music from the wedding reception echoed faintly in the background as Alexander and Jamal stood in the quiet staff area, the weight of their conversation still hanging between them. There was a tense silence, both men unsure of what to do next. Alexander felt like he was standing at the edge of something huge, something that could change everything. He had just discovered that the man he had treated poorly was his brother. It was hard to believe, but now, facing Jamal, it felt real. Jamal stood with his arms crossed, his eyes still clouded with confusion. His emotions were all over the place. He had always known something was missing in his life, but never in a million years had he imagined that it might be a brother, let alone someone like Alexander. He looked at the man who had insulted him earlier, the man who had made him feel invisible, and now that same man was standing before him, admitting the truth. Jamal didn't know how to feel. He was torn between anger and a strange sense of curiosity. "I don't know what to say," Jamal finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was quieter than before, as though he was trying to process everything. "I spent years trying to figure out where I come from. And now this. You're telling me we're brothers, but I can't just forget everything that happened earlier tonight." Alexander nodded, feeling the sting of Jamal's words. He understood. He had hurt Jamal, and no apology could erase that. He had been rude, dismissive, and blind to the truth about Jamal's life. There was no way to take back the insults, but he could at least try to make things right from here on. "I know I can't fix it all with words," Alexander said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I can't change what I said to you, but I want to try and make it up to you. I want to get to know you, Jamal. I want to be a brother to you, if you'll let me." Jamal's eyes softened slightly, though there was still a wall between them. "I don't know, Alex. This is a lot to take in. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be a part of your world, your family." Alexander felt his heart drop at the harshness in Jamal's words, but he knew it was the truth. Jamal hadn't chosen this, and Alexander had no right to expect instant forgiveness. "I know, but I want to be here for you, Jamal," Alexander said. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, and I don't want to force anything. But I hope we can take small steps toward getting to know each other without any pressure." Jamal remained quiet for a moment, clearly deep in thought. It wasn't easy for him to trust anyone, especially someone who had hurt him. But there was something in Alexander's words, a sincerity that made Jamal pause. He wasn't sure if he was ready to forgive, but maybe he could start somewhere. Maybe they could start with the truth and go from there. "I don't know what it'll look like between us, but I guess we'll see," Jamal said at last, his voice more neutral but with a hint of something softer. Alexander's heart lifted slightly at Jamal's words. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They were beginning to find common ground, even if it was just the smallest step. "Well, I'm here whenever you're ready," Alexander said, giving Jamal a tentative smile. "I don't want to rush anything, but I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Jamal nodded slowly, a small cautious smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I'll keep that in mind." Just then, they heard a voice calling from the hall. It was Sophia, Alexander's bride, looking for him. She had been watching from a distance, noticing the change in the atmosphere. "Are you two all right?" Sophia asked, her voice filled with concern as she walked over to them. Alexander glanced at Jamal, who gave him a nod, signaling that he was okay for now. "We're getting there," Alexander said, glancing back at Jamal. "We're taking it one step at a time." Sophia smiled warmly. "I'm glad to hear that. It's not going to be easy, but I believe you both can get there." With that, Sophia gently wrapped her arm around Alexander's, and Jamal stood off to the side, still processing everything. The night was far from over, but in that moment, things had already started to shift. The past couldn't be erased, but the future was theirs to shape. As the wedding reception continued, Alexander and Jamal remained in the quiet staff area, each taking the first steps toward a relationship neither of them had expected. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, they both felt like they were on the same path, headed toward a future that, just maybe, they could build together. The night was coming to an end, and the last of the wedding guests were starting to leave. The grand hall, once filled with laughter and dancing, had quieted down. But for Alexander and Jamal, the evening was far from over. The truth had come to light, and though the weight of it still lingered, something had shifted between them. As the last few guests exchanged their goodbyes, Alexander and Jamal remained in the quiet staff area. There was a sense of calm now, after the storm of emotions earlier. They were no longer just two strangers or enemies, but brothers who were starting to understand one another. Jamal sat on a nearby chair, still processing everything. The evening had been a whirlwind. A few hours ago, he had been a waiter, just doing his job. Now, he was sitting face to face with his half-brother. It felt surreal. The man who had insulted him, who had treated him like an outsider, was now his family. "You know, I never imagined something like this happening," Jamal said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of disbelief in it. "All my life, I've wondered who I was, where I came from. But I never expected to find family like this. It's a lot to take in." Alexander nodded, understanding the weight of Jamal's words. "I get it. I really do. I can't pretend to know what it's been like for you, Jamal. But I want to understand. I want to be there for you. I know I've messed up. But I'm here now. I want to make it right." Jamal looked at him, his eyes thoughtful. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I guess we can try. It's just strange, you know, to go from being nobody to suddenly being connected to all of this." He gestured vaguely, indicating the wealth and family that had been kept from him for so long. Alexander smiled slightly, though his own heart felt heavy. "I can't imagine what it's been like. But maybe, just maybe, you don't have to be part of this world to be family. You're my brother, and that's what matters now." Jamal's expression softened a little at that. "I never wanted the money or the fancy life," he said quietly. "But I guess I've always wanted to know where I came from, who I really am." "You'll figure that out," Alexander said, his voice sincere, "and I'll be here to help, no matter what." The silence between them felt different now. It wasn't the cold, awkward silence from earlier. It was a quieter, more comfortable kind of silence. They were both beginning to accept the strange reality of their situation. Sophia walked over to them, her steps light as she joined the conversation. "I'm glad to see you two talking," she said, her smile warm. "I know this isn't easy, but you're doing the right thing." Alexander looked up at her, gratitude in his eyes. "I'm trying, Soph. I really am." She reached out and took his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "And that's all that matters. It's going to take time, but you'll figure it out. Together." Jamal stood up, looking at both of them. "I don't know what comes next, but I guess I'm willing to try. Maybe we can start over, take it slow. I can't promise everything will be perfect, but we can figure it out." Alexander stood as well, extending his hand to Jamal. "That's all I'm asking. One step at a time." Jamal looked at his hand for a moment before shaking it firmly. The gesture felt awkward, but it also felt real. They were family, and that simple handshake was a promise, one that they both knew would take time to build. As the night wrapped up, the three of them walked out of the hall together. The wedding had come to an end, but for Alexander and Jamal, their journey was just beginning. They didn't have all the answers, and there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time, they felt like they had a chance at a new beginning. The future was uncertain, but as brothers, they knew they would face it together.